You hear that Native people are the sentinels of the Arctic, and that's true. We've been hearing about climate change for almost a decade now. We've been hearing reports from local hunters for the last 20 to 30 years about changing sea ice conditions, extent and duration. As sentinels, they are responsive immediately to changes or fluctuations in their environment and changing climatological patterns as well. One of the first pieces of direction our founder, my mentor Charlie Johnson, gave me was to go to Barrow to meet our chairman Charlie Brower. His instruction for me was to eat a pot of his polar bear soup. It was my first experience with polar bears. They wanted me to come up there, eat polar bear, interact with polar bear, so that I would be a more effective advocate for our continued ability to harvest polar bears to feed ourselves. Polar bears just aren't iconic species of the Arctic. They aren't something to be revered in a zoo, photographs, postcards, but they are intricate and living parts of people's histories, cultures, and environment.
We have dances about them, we have stories about them.
As Native people, we had sort of inherent conservation values. If we over-harvested, we wouldn't have the ability to feed ourselves the next season. Polar bears have now become the global iconic species of the Arctic.
We told scientists that our ice was thinner, but they didn't believe us until the scientists studied the ice conditions up here, and now everybody knows that our ice is thinner and our climate is getting warmer.
The primary threat facing polar bears today is habitat loss due to global climate change.
While it brings a global focus and a global perspective on sort of the plight of the polar bear, there are these unfair demands on indigenous people who still continue to use polar bears as food.
PBI does support a well-managed subsistence harvest for sure.
Polar bears are still at levels in many areas of the world that can still support harvest, so long as that harvest benefits the local communities. Unlike climate change, which takes decades to revert the impacts of, harvest is something we can manage in real time.
People who live and utilize the resources should have a significant part of how these resources are managed. And our founder said that the U.S. federal government was going to have a formal role in polar bear management. Native people should have a role in that as well. 15 villages passed resolutions under this authority of co-management. So we represent 15 communities from Kaktovik to St. Lawrence Island in the management of the 2 U.S. polar bear populations.
We recognize the reality that if we're talking about conserving a species, we have to work with the people who live with that species. If we want a resilient population of polar bears, we need resilient communities that are going to live in health and harmony with those bears. So I see Western science and indigenous knowledge as being very complementary systems. With indigenous knowledge, you have a very deep and historical set of knowledge about a place and wildlife that uses that place and the physical attributes of the place. In this case of the Arctic, we're thinking of things like sea ice, snow that are really important. Science can complement that local knowledge in a shorter time scale.
Yeah, that's a dam. She's digging out.
Yeah.
That's fresh snow.
Look at that hot snow that she's piled out.
It can also take us much broader spatially, so we can get a slightly larger view and go beyond where people actually use the land. Adding those two layers together to me is much more useful and informative than trying to keep them apart.
If we want bears for our next generation, we got to start thinking about trying to save them. And I think it's really important to save their environment.
Rather than having these ideas about how to manage local resources come from agencies or individuals who have never even set foot in the Arctic, we know that doesn't work. taking the approach of the polar bear management that each local village should be taking the initiative in developing what works for them in that local village.
The people who live here know about our climate, know about living in these conditions, and we share these conditions with the polar bear.
It's very easy to sit from afar and cast stones at indigenous lifestyles. The perspective that most policymakers don't have is the direct impacts that those decisions and policy has on the indigenous people.
So we still rely a lot on the native food, and we're trying to keep it so our next generation, like my grandchildren, continue to harvest that food.
The only place I want to be is out there on the ocean, on the ice, with my uncles, with my cousins, with everyone in the village.
Hunt for sea mammals and fill up our freezers.